Let's now start building the How It Works section. And so here we are going to build something similar to what I drew in this sketch here. So yet another one of these beautiful sketches here that I have. And you see that we have something like a Z pattern here. So similar to that example that is here on the bottom right. Now here, each of the rows of this Z pattern will be for one of the steps of how OmniFoot works. Okay, so with those big numbers, a bit similar to that very first design that I have here at the very top. So we're gonna have those big numbers, then something like a smaller heading, and then some description of the step itself. And then on the side of that, there's going to be one of the 3 application screens that we got from OmniFoot. And above all that, I also want to add a headline, something like this other small design example that I have here. So where we have this big headline, which is a bit informative about what this section is all about. And then above that, in this small in color text, there is a very direct description of the section. So basically naming the section. And so as I mentioned before, this is a very nice pattern that I have been seeing. And so I would like to use that now right here. Okay, so I hope this looks like fun. And so let's now get started with this. And actually in the last lecture, we already created the section here. And of course, also these container and grid classes. But let's remove all of this and start over with a blank section. And so now let's add our first container element here for the section heading. So I'm going to give it the class of container because of course we're going to want to have these headings centered on the page. And here it's now time to use the h2 element. So after the h1 that we had here, so right here, this is the primary heading with the h1. And so remember, there should only be one h1 per page. And so now in each of the sections, we're going to use the h2. And again, I'm giving each of the headings a class name so that I can select everything using classes. And so this is a heading secondary. Okay. And I think here we actually do have the heading. So that's this one, your daily dose of health in 3 simple steps. So this is quite a descriptive heading of this section. But remember that now, before that, we also want to add basically the name of the section to make it a little bit easier for the eye to scan quickly the page in case we don't have the time to read this big heading here. Then we can simply read how it works. And then immediately it becomes clear what this section is all about. Now here you might think that we could use like an h3 element, for example, because this one is simply smaller than the h2, and so h3 might look like a good choice. But actually it is not a good choice, because if this was an h3 here, this would actually not be a heading of any new part inside of this section. So basically this h3, the goal of it is to describe what this h2 is all about. So basically naming it in a way, right? And so I believe that here using a heading like this, so an element which has the semantic meaning of a heading is not the right choice. So we can of course use h3 in this section here, but it should then actually describe some new part of the section. Okay. And we will, in fact, use an h3 in a minute, and then it will make a bit more sense. So here we should just use something generic, like a paragraph, or maybe even a span. So remember, span is like a generic text element. And so let's use that here. And let's call it a subheading. So not heating. That's right. And so here we write how it works. Okay. All right. And now let's actually add our Z pattern. So basically all those elements which have the text and the images So basically the content that we want for this section. Now, where should we put all that? Should we put it also inside of this container right here? Well, not really, right? Because for the layout of that component, so of that Z pattern, we will probably need our grid, right? And so we do not want that grid here. Here we only want these headings. And so we can simply create a new div element and also call it a container. That is no problem at all. Okay. Now we could also, of course, have created simply a new div in here, like this, and then call that one a grid. So that would have worked as well, but I think it's cleaner to just keep adding new containers like this. Then these pieces are a bit more self-contained, right? So we have just one container for the headings, and then we can actually nicely copy that here from one section to the next one without worrying what comes next. All right, so then here we have our container, and this is probably where the grid will be. But for now, let's not worry about the visual part here and only about the content. So if you remember the sketch that I showed you in the beginning of this lecture, you will remember that there was like a box on the left side with some text content, and then on the right side, the image, right? And so let's now create boxes for those two. So let's call this a step text box. And then the other one will be a text box for the image. Let's actually put that right here immediately. So step image box. And since we're here, and since this one is very easy, let's immediately put the image right here. And so it is inside the app folder. And then, of course, we're starting with the app screen number 1. Then let's give it a class of step image, which is why the parent element is called the step image box. And so then, of course, we need the alt text. Never forget that. And here, this is actually on an iPhone. So I'm calling it iPhone app preferences selection screen. Giving it a save. That's not correct. Let's just quickly take a look at the image just so the description makes more sense. And so, yeah, this is like a screen where the user can select their preferences. And so that's why that's the description that I gave it here. Okay. And now here, as for the text content, remember we want the number of the step. Then we want like a heading, a smaller one, and then some text description after that. So let's use a P here for each of them. So here, let's call it the step number. And it starts with 0, 1, of course. And now it's actually time for that H3 that I mentioned before. And first of all, let's get our content here. So we have these 3 blocks, and this one is the first one. Let's get that. And let's just paste that in here for now. Okay. So we have all of this here, and it's kind of separated here with this colon. So this here is probably the right text for the heading, and this then for kind of the description of this step. Okay. Well, actually, it shouldn't be here. It doesn't make any sense. It should be here indeed. And now I'm just cutting this part here, and I'm going to put it inside an H3. And again, I'm assuming that this one here might be reused across the page. And so I'm giving it a more general name, and I'm not going to call it like step heading or something. Okay. So I'm calling it heading tertiary now, because it might be reused somewhere else. And so on headings, that happens all the time, and therefore they are a nice candidate of giving them like a general name like this. Okay. And now let's just add a paragraph again for the description of the step here. So step description. Okay. Just removing these colons here. And there we go. So as I was saying before, now here it actually makes sense to use an H3 because this kind of introduces a new part inside of this section, which is this piece of content that comes after it. So here it does make sense to use an H3, while here it really didn't make a lot of sense. So that's why we went with this generic span here. Okay, now let's just take a quick look here and, well, there we go. So the image, as always, is very large, and they are, of course, not side by side yet. But, of course, we want them side by side, and so let's now use our grid class. So let's go up here. And so the container, we already have it right here. And then let's add the grid. And just like this, we easily transformed this into a grid container which has this gap here. So all without writing any new additional CSS. And then of course, this one is the one with 2 columns. Okay. Now this gap here is just temporary. It might not be the one that we use in the end. So we're probably going to change that later. And here, quickly getting rid of this background color. Okay, nice. And now this image, as always, is way too big. So let's make it flexible by saying that it should occupy only basically 100% of the available parent. So images are always one of the first things that we have to style because, as I mentioned, they do not automatically scale up or down like text. So let's just say with 100%, or let's even go for 50% for now, because 100% also seems kind of large. And so with this we are safe, at least for now. So we're just experimenting here anyway for now. And so yeah, that looks better. Can of course inspect this very quickly. And indeed, now each of the 2 columns are the same size, as we can see here. And yeah, the image occupies exactly half, so 50% of the parent container, which of course is this step image box here. Okay, but for now, let's not worry too much about the visual style, and instead, let's keep adding our next step here. Okay. Now, before going back, remember that now we want it the opposite way. So here we have the text on the left side, the image on the right. But since we're building a Z pattern, which remember is quite popular on startup sites like this one, then we will now have the image on the left side and the text on the right. And so what that means is that the next element in the grid will be, again, an image, right? So it's the opposite now. So yeah, here we had first the step text box and then the step image box, but now we will have the step image box first. And here I forgot to close this. Now that's better, but still Google Chrome managed to fix the code, because you see that actually it looked the same before, so it looked correct before. And so that's because browsers are actually very forgiving with our errors in the HTML. They will still try to understand it and then fix these errors internally. But anyway, let's now go to step 2, and let me actually add some comments here. So right in the HTML, and remember, we can hit Command/ for that, or Control/ on Windows. So here that's step 01, just so we don't get confused as the code gets longer and longer. So step 2, and eventually we're gonna have a step 3. And why not copy this here immediately? So 2 and 3. But of course, we now need different descriptions. So now we need to describe this one here. So it's still an iPhone app. Let's call it the meal approving plan. Because, well, that's what this one here is all about, basically. So there's one of these meals here per day, and then the user can approve it or not. And then the app screen number 3 is basically for the delivery. Right? So let's call that iPhone app delivery screen, and here screen as well. Okay, and now let's get the step text box here. But remember that here in step number 2, it should appear after the image, so that it's on the right side then, while here in step number 3, we are building the Z pattern, and so it is now back to the beginning. Okay, and now just replacing the content here, 0, 2, triple clicking here, and putting it here. And this, of course, belongs again in the H3. And then finally, step number 3. So creating the HTML is always some copy pasting. That's just completely normal. So just as I'm doing here. Okay. Here we need to use step 03, but now we should be good. And indeed, we now have a nice Z pattern. So beautiful, well, except for, of course, the text formatting and the size of these images, but the content itself is already arranged in the right way. So the layout is already working thanks to our reusable grid. And yeah, so now let's take care, I would say, of styling first this heading and this subheading right here. So that's the heading tertiary. Oh, actually not, it's the heading secondary and the subheading. And so these are going to be reusable. So let's put them up here. So close to the other heading. And well, since we're building another heading here, we can use some of the same design elements as here. So we might use the same color, the same font weight, and maybe also the same letter spacing here in the heading secondary. And so we should probably not just copy them here, right? That would not make a lot of sense. So instead, we can create a list of selectors for the heading primary and the heading secondary, and then simply add the styles that are common to them right here. So moving down so that we can select all 3 of them at the same time, and then move them all up here. And so now immediately with this, the heading secondary also has this color, this font weight, and also the decreased letter spacing. Now, of course, the font size should be smaller. So let's go maybe one step down from 52 to 44. So that's exactly why we have this system. Otherwise, now we would have to think about this font size. So should we use 40 pixels or 45 or 35? But no, we don't have to think. We just choose this value and then we just check out if it looks nice or not. And let's actually do that right now. And yeah, I think that is not too big. The color is also good. We just didn't define any line height because it is just one line, at least in this width. Because imagine that the page gets small, well, then the line height is not so well defined. So let's give it some line height here. And since the text is still quite large, let's go with 1.2 here. And that didn't look as if it changed a lot, but yeah, still that looks good. So let's keep it this way. And yeah, about the color here, I just chose it at the beginning of this section here. It seemed kind of randomly, right? Just this 333. So I told you back then that I simply like to use these gray colors, which all have the same number. So we used 333 for basically the darker text, and then 555 for the lighter text. But of course, we could also have, for example, used a shadow, or actually a shade. So for example, instead of using like 333, we could have used this value here. So just to illustrate that, let me actually do that here. So I'm just declaring it after this one, so it will then override it. So no need to replace that one. And so you see that this still looks quite decent. Maybe it's a bit too dark. Let's go with this one. And I'm not going to keep this anyway, but just to show you that this actually does look quite good as well. And it nicely integrates actually with the rest of the colors, like with this orange color. And that makes sense because, well, that was actually the starting point of creating this color in the first place. Now, the reason why I'm not using this color here for our design and a similar one for the rest of the text is because that will kind of move us away a little bit from the typical look of the startup website personality, which uses more of the gray color than really these like earthy looking colors. So colors like brown and things like that. So here we are going more for a little bit more traditional gray, I would say. And so that's why I simply went with a regular gray instead of using a shade. Also, instead of using a shade, we could of course also use the color from OpenColor here. For example, this one here. So this is actually quite similar to 333. And so, yeah, why not try that out as well? I will actually keep this here just as a comment, like as a reference that you could have used that one. Okay. And so this looks decent as well. However, these gray colors here, they have a little bit of a blue touch. So if you look closely, they are gray, but they are pushed a little bit into the blue direction. So I think that doesn't really fit our background color here, and of course our primary color as well. And so that's the reason why I went against that. So just trying to give you some more insights into the design choices here. Right. And so again, for a startup personality, I think one of these neutral grays that is really a true gray works just fine. Okay. But anyway, now about the subheading. First of all, let's actually make it a block, because remember that we used a span. And the span is an inline element, and so we need to make it a block before doing anything else. Then let's give it a font size, and let's just start at 20 pixels. We can always tone it down a little bit then. And the font weight, of course, needs to be a bit smaller now. So not 700, maybe 500. So slightly above the regular. So medium, I think I called that. And now here, remember, we want our primary color. So that's, it's already here. So that's this one. But actually, we should not use this one, because remember that there is some issues with using these colors on, and let me show it to you. So remember using this orange color on this background color right here. So the color contrast ratio was not perfect for that. And so I will actually use this orange color for the subheadings as well. Now in this case, of course, it is on the regular white background, so it might be okay, but probably at some later point, it will not. And so let's give it again this darker orange color. And just by the way, I'm noticing here that the text is way too big. So let's put it a little bit down. So maybe 1.6. And here I'm going for that darker tone now. Okay, let's now also make it uppercase. So text transform uppercase and also some margin to the bottom of 1.6 rem. And by the way, maybe you've been noticing something that I have been doing for some time actually, which is to write these property names here in VS Code simply like this. So without any hyphen, for example, and simply keep writing. And so that works because VS Code will still recognize what I want when I then use the autocomplete with enter like this, right? And I can even like do it just with the first few words, and then I can start writing the BO for bottom, and then still VS Code will recognize it. And I also do it for stuff like background color. So I can immediately start writing the color, and then immediately it will give me the property that I'm looking for. Right? So that's just another nice trick of VS Code. And yeah, here we're just missing some big spacing below this heading. And also we can give this one here an additional touch by adding some space between the letters. So when the text is really small in uppercase, it looks nicer, like it gives it some space to breathe if we add some letter spacing there. So I believe that will look really nice. So letter spacing like 0.75 pixels. And of course, you can experiment around with this as you like. And actually, this is already the second time we have used some letter spacing. So let's add that here to our design decisions, basically. So we have used this one and also minus 0.5 pixels before. And we have also already used a 1.2 at some point. So let's call this medium, for example. The name doesn't really matter. It's just so we keep on keeping track, basically, of our design decisions. Okay, now just here, let's add some big space to the bottom here. So again, using that trick of simply starting to write the second part of the property name. And here again, let's actually go for 9.6 rem. Okay, you might think that this maybe looks a bit too much because that is also the padding of the section itself, but it will not be. Let me explain you why. And so the reason is because, as I said, we have 9.6 rem, so 96 pixels here. So between the beginning of the section and the beginning of the content, but we also have 96 pixels here. So this one is also plus another 96 pixels. And so here we have like 192 pixels, I think, between all of this. And so having then 92 pixels here should be then good again. So basically to have this part here, so this heading, stand out nicely from the content that comes next. And that will of course be way better visible once we actually style all of this here. But let's leave that to the next lecture actually. So hopefully I see you there soon.